Asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. The Locked Wooden Door. Asterisk, asterisk. The dust came first. It was a herald, a fine red powder that rose in a cloud on the horizon long before the tired groan of the stagecoach axles could be heard. By the time the coach lurched to a halt in the center of Dry Hollow's single, rutted street, the dust had settled on everything. It coated the unpainted false fronts of the saloon and the general store, filled the cracks in the boardwalk, and caked the tongues of the few men who bothered to stop their work and watch the new arrival. June Ellison was the first one out. She didn't wait for the driver's offered hand, but instead swung herself down from the high step, her worn leather boots landing with a soft thud in the thick dust. The town went quiet for a moment. A hammer striking an anvil at the far end of the street fell silent. The low murmur of conversation from the saloon's bat-wing doors died away. They were all looking. She was not what they expected. Women in Dry Hollow were either wives, worn thin and brittle by the sun and the work, or they were saloon girls, painted and soft in a way that was meant to be broken. June was neither. She was tall, taller than most of the men now staring at her, with shoulders that spoke of carrying her own burdens. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned back in a severe knot that no amount of dust or wind could unravel. Her face was plain in its strength, with a firm jaw and eyes the color of a stormy sky just before the rain. There was no welcome in them, but no fear either, just a deep, settled weariness. A town built on men's labor and whispered rumors didn't see many women like her. A woman alone was either a tragedy or a target. She pulled her single, scarred wooden trunk from the boot of the coach herself, the muscles in her arms cording as she lifted its weight. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco stains in his beard, simply watched, then spat a brown stream into the dirt. "That'll be all, ma'am," he grunted, already eager to be on his way to somewhere with more water and less dust. June gave a curt nod, her eyes scanning the collection of buildings that constituted Dry Hollow. It was a place born of desperation and sustained by stubbornness. A gold strike, some years back, had birthed it. Now, with the surface gold gone, men burrowed into the hard earth for coal, their faces permanently smudged with black, their coughs a rattling rhythm that echoed through the valley. It was a town that held on, because letting go meant admitting failure, and the men here were too proud for that. Her gaze settled on the largest building, the one with Silas Blackwood, General Mercantile, painted in faded letters above the door. She walked toward it, her back straight, her stride long and even. She ignored the stares that followed her like flies. She had felt stares in a dozen other towns. They no longer pricked her skin. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap. A portly man with a slick of thinning hair combed over a bald patch looked up from behind the counter. This was Silas Blackwood, a man who measured his importance by the amount of gossip he collected. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes taking in her height, her plain calico dress, and the resolute set of her jaw. "I was told in the next town over that there was a cabin for rent here, on the edge of the woods," June said. Her voice was low, and like the rest of her, held no unnecessary softness. Silas leaned on the counter, polishing a smudge with his sleeve. "The old Miller place ain't been lived in for a couple years. Roof leaks in the spring, and the well water's got a taste of iron, but it's sturdy." He paused, waiting. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy. Asterisk. Why would a woman like you want a place like that, asterisk? June didn't offer an explanation. She simply reached into the small reticule tied at her waist and placed a few coins on the worn wooden counter. "This should cover the first month. I'll need some supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, and a new axe head if you have one." The axe head surprised him. He raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to comment. There was a wall around this woman, and he had a sense it was not one a man could talk his way through. "All right then," he said, his tone shifting from curious to businesslike. "Place is yours. but it's a good 2-mile walk from here, and that trunk looks heavy." "I'll manage," she said. Silas shook his head. "No need. Colt can take you." He gestured with his chin toward the back of the store, where a man had been standing in the shadows, examining a display of harnesses. The man stepped forward into the single shaft of dusty sunlight slanting through the grimy window. He was as tall as she was, maybe taller, with the lean, hard-muscled build of someone who worked from sunup to sundown. His face was weathered by the sun, bracketed by dark, unruly hair, and his eyes were a quiet, steady brown. He wore denim trousers and a faded flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms thick with sinew. He looked at her, and his gaze was different from the others. It was not probing or judging. It was just seeing. He assessed her the way a carpenter assesses a piece of wood, noting its grain, its strength, its flaws, without passing sentence. This was Colt Avery. "Colt, this here is Miss—" Silas trailed off, realizing he hadn't asked her name. "Ellison," she supplied. "June Ellison." "Miss Ellison. She's taken the old Miller place. Needs a ride out there with her trunk." Colt Avery simply nodded. He didn't speak. He walked past her, out the door, and a few minutes later, the sound of a wagon creaking to a stop could be heard outside. June gathered her purchased supplies into a burlap sack, paid Silas, and walked back out into the oppressive afternoon sun. Her trunk was already loaded in the back of a sturdy buckboard wagon, hitched to a pair of patient, well-kept mules. Colt stood by the wagon seat, holding the reins. He didn't move to help her up. He just waited, assuming she was as capable as she looked. She appreciated the small, unspoken courtesy. She climbed up and settled herself on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her back ramrod straight. The journey was made in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the soft clopping of the mule's hooves. Colt did not ask where she was from. He did not ask why she was here. He did not ask if she was married, or widowed, or running from something. He just drove, his hands sure on the reins, his eyes on the road ahead. June found the silence more comfortable than any conversation she'd had in years. It was a clean silence, not one filled with things unsaid, but one that demanded nothing. She watched the town fall away behind them, replaced by sparse grassland and then the thickening pines that marked the edge of the forest. The air grew cooler here, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It was a lonely smell, but a clean one. She carried so little with her. The trunk held 2 more dresses, a set of leather-working tools, a worn Bible with her mother's name on the inside cover, and a small, tin box she never opened. That was all that was left of a life she had tried to build somewhere else. What she truly carried couldn't be packed in a trunk. It was a hollowness in her chest, a wariness in her soul. It was the memory of a promise that had dissolved like sugar in the rain, and a trust that had been shattered so completely she wasn't sure she could ever piece it back together. She had learned the hard way that people leave. They always leave. The only things that stayed were the land, the sky, and the pain you carried inside you. The wagon turned off the main path and onto a barely there trail, the branches of pine and oak scraping against the sides of the buckboard. After another quarter-mile, a small clearing opened up, and in it stood the cabin. Silas was right. It was a sorry sight. The porch sagged on one side, a few shingles were missing from the roof, and the windows were dark with grime. But the stone chimney was solid, and the log walls looked true. A wild, thorny rosebush had grown up one side, its deep red flowers a startling splash of beauty against the weathered gray wood. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop. He hopped down and, without a word, went to the back and lifted her heavy trunk as if it were filled with cotton. He carried it up the 3 creaking steps and set it down on the porch. He did not wait for thanks. He turned and looked at her, still sitting on the wagon seat, His brown eyes held hers for a long moment. It was the first time he had truly looked asterisk at asterisk her since the store. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, not pity, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw the wall she had built around herself and, instead of trying to scale it, simply acknowledged its existence. June reached again for her reticule, her fingers fumbling for a coin. "For your trouble," she said, holding it out to him. Colt looked at the coin in her palm, then back at her face. He gave a slight shake of his head. "No trouble," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like he didn't use it often. It was the only thing he said to her the entire time. He turned, swung himself back onto the wagon, and with a soft click of his tongue to the mules, he was gone. June stood on the sagging porch of her new home, listening to the sound of the wagon creaking away, until it was swallowed by the silence of the woods. She was alone. She looked at the cabin's heavy wooden door. Her hand went to the rusted iron latch. It was cold to the touch. She pushed, and with a groan of protest, the door swung inward, revealing a dark, musty interior thick with the ghosts of other people's lives. It didn't matter. It was a place with 4 walls and a roof. A place with a door she could lock. And for now, that was all she needed. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 2. Closing wounds. Asterisk, asterisk. The days in Dry Hollow settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun. For June Ellison, that rhythm was work. She rose before the first light painted the eastern hills, her movements purposeful in the cool pre-dawn air. She was not a woman who wasted motion or words. Silence was her companion, and labor was her prayer. The property she'd rented was a testament to neglect. The fence line that separated her small yard from the encroaching forest was a collection of rotted posts and sagging wire. She started there. Each morning, she would take the new axe head she'd bought from Silas Blackwood and venture into the woods, felling young, straight pines. The sharp, clean scent of the sap was the only perfume she knew. She'd drag them back, her boots scuffing paths in the dirt, and spend the rest of the day digging post holes in the rocky soil. The work was grueling. It blistered her hands and made her back ache with a fire that lingered long after sundown. But each new post she set, solid and true in the earth, felt like a small victory. She wasn't just building a fence, she was defining a boundary. This small piece of the world was hers, and she would defend it with sweat and splinters. When the fence was done, its lines straight and its wire pulled taut, she turned her attention to the small, dilapidated stable. The roof sagged in the middle like the spine of an old horse, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. She started by tearing out the rotten timbers, the wood crumbling into dust in her hands. She worked with a focused intensity that left no room for thought, no space for the ghosts of the past to whisper in her ear. Her isolation was absolute, and by her own design, when she needed supplies, she walked the 2 miles into town, her list committed to memory. She would enter Silas's store, state her needs, pay her coin, and leave. She met the curious gazes of the other patrons with a placid wall of indifference. They saw her calloused hands, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the way she carried a 50-pound sack of flour over her shoulder as if it were a bolt of cloth. And they talked. The talk was a low hum, like bees in a distant clover field. It happened over cracker barrels and laundry lines. "Does the work of a man," one would say, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "Too proud, that one," a woman might counter, snapping a sheet in the wind. Never a smile, never a good day. The most pointed talk, however, happened on Sunday mornings, as the church bell tolled, its sound carrying clear and lonely all the way to her cabin. June would be outside, hammering a loose board into place or sharpening the blade of her axe. She did not go to church. She did not seek solace in the preacher's words or the company of the righteous. The last time she had sat in a pew, it was next to a man who had promised her forever in the eyes of God, and then had left her when he learned her body could not bear fruit. She had decided then that her communion would be with the earth under her feet and the sky above her head. They were honest in their cruelties and their comforts. They never made a promise they couldn't keep. The townsfolk, however, saw it as a deliberate shunning, an affront. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was as starched and stiff as her Sunday collar, remarked to a small group in the mercantile, "A soul that does not seek the Lord's house is a soul that is lost or hiding." Her words were meant to be heard, and they were. Colt Avery was a man who heard most things and spoke of none. He saw June working, just as the rest of the town did, but he saw it differently. He drove his wagon past the turnoff to her cabin on his way to check his traps or haul timber. He saw the new, pale wood of the fence posts standing in a proud line. He saw her on a rickety ladder, wrestling with a beam for the stable roof, her jaw set in determination. He never stopped. He never waved, but he saw. One morning, June came out to find a stack of freshly cut cedar shakes leaning against her porch steps. They were perfect for the stable roof, uniform and well-made. There was no note, no sign of who had left them. She stood for a long time, just looking at them, a knot of suspicion tightening in her gut. Nothing was free. Every kindness she had ever been shown had come with a price tag, a debt to be paid later. She scanned the tree line. Her eyes narrowed, but saw nothing but the shifting leaves. She used the shakes, but the work felt different, tainted by an obligation she hadn't asked for. A week later, it happened again. She had spent a frustrating day trying to rig a pulley to lift a heavy crossbeam into place, her rope old and fraying dangerously. The next morning, a thick coil of new manila rope was hanging from the post of her porch. This time, she knew. Only one person had a wagon that passed this way. Only one person had seen her need. She felt a prickle of anger. She was not a charity case. She did not need a man's help. The next time she went to town, she carried a few extra coins, intending to find Colt Avery and pay him for his materials, but he was nowhere to be seen. Silas said he was up in the high country, wouldn't be back for days. The anger slowly seeped away, leaving behind a confusing residue. He continued to come, always in the quiet hours of the early morning or late evening. He never approached the house directly. He would leave things at the edge of her property. By the new fence line, a sack of potatoes and onions, a jar of what looked to be homemade preserves, a bundle of firewood cut to the perfect length for her small stove, left just as the first cold snap of autumn arrived. He asked for nothing. He accepted nothing. She once saw his wagon returning down the path as she was coming back from the well. She stood and waited. He stopped the wagon. "Mr. Avery," she said, her voice stiff, "I can't accept these things." He looked at her, his steady brown eyes taking in the defiant set of her shoulders. He just gave a small nod, as if acknowledging her words, then clicked his tongue to the mules and drove on, leaving her standing there with her buckets and her pride. The next week, she found a freshly dressed rabbit in a clean muslin cloth hanging from a nail on the stable door. He hadn't stopped leaving things. He had simply stopped leaving them where she had to walk past them. It was his silent answer, asterisk. It is not for you to accept or refuse. It is just there. Every night, the ritual was the same. After a simple meal of bread and whatever she had on hand, she would clean her plate, bank the fire, and walk to the front door. She would slide the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets. The solid asterisk thump asterisk was the last sound of her day, a punctuation mark that closed her off from the world. She would stand by the window, peering through a tiny gap in the thin curtains she had hung, and watch the darkness. She'd watch the stars emerge, cold and distant. She'd listen to the call of a lone owl. She was safe inside. The bar on the door was a promise she made to herself: no one gets in. No one gets close enough to leave another scar. But summer lingered that year, clinging on with a humid, breathless heat that made the small cabin feel like an oven. The air grew thick and heavy at night, too stifling to breathe. For 3 nights she lay on her narrow cot, sweating, the air so still it felt like a blanket smothering her. On the 4th night, she couldn't bear it. After she had barred the front door, she walked into the small kitchen at the back of the cabin. The window there was small and looked out not toward the path, but into the deep, anonymous woods. She hesitated, her hand on the simple wooden latch. The night was full of sounds, crickets, the rustle of some small animal in the undergrowth, sounds of a world that was alive and breathing just outside her walls. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted the latch and pushed the window open just a few inches. A breeze, cool and smelling of pine and damp earth, whispered into the room. It touched her face, a balm on her hot skin. It felt like the cabin itself was taking its first deep breath in a long time. The front door was still locked, the heavy bar firmly in place. But here, in the back, a small opening had been made. It was not a surrender. It was a concession, a small crack in the fortress she had so carefully built. And as she finally drifted off to sleep, with the cool night air on her face, she was admitting a truth she had long denied. Even the most fortified soul needs a little room to breathe. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 3. The Ghost of a Promise, asterisk, asterisk. Autumn was beginning to lay its cool hand on the high country. The fierce heat of summer had broken, and the air in Dry Hollow now carried a crisp, clean edge, smelling of pine and the coming frost. The dust had settled, dampened by a rare overnight shower, and the town felt momentarily washed clean. It was on such a morning that June walked to town. The stable was finished, its new roof a testament to her labor and the anonymous gift of cedar shakes. She needed leather-thick, oiled hide for a set of saddlebags she planned to craft. Her small cache of coins was dwindling, and the work of her hands was the only currency she trusted. As she approached the mercantile, she saw Colt Avery's buckboard wagon parked outside. He was loading several long, rough-hewn timbers, his movements economical and powerful. His hands, she noticed, were wrapped in thick leather work gloves stained dark with pine resin. He saw her approach and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was their established greeting, a silent acknowledgement that required no reply. June nodded back, a barely perceptible dip of her chin, and went inside the store. The bell above the door jingled, and Silas Blackwood looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Miss Ellison. Come for more nails?" he asked, a small, knowing smile on his face. He'd seen the progress on her cabin and, like the rest of the town, had formed his own theories about the materials that seemed to appear on her doorstep. "Leather today, Mr. Blackwood," she said, ignoring his gentle prodding. "The best you have." As Silas heaved a large roll of hide onto the counter, the bell jingled again, but this time, the sound was different. It was accompanied by the light, musical laughter of a woman and the confident stride of a man whose boots were not made for walking through mud and dust. June felt a change in the air before she even turned. It was a subtle shift, the way the temperature drops just before a storm. A scent of expensive bay rum cologne cut through the familiar smells of the store. She kept her back to the door, focusing on the grain of the leather under her fingertips, her knuckles white. "Mr. Blackwood," a smooth, cultured voice said. "A pleasure to see you. My fiancée and I were just passing through on our way from Clayton. I promised her the scenic route." June's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She had heard it whisper promises against her ear in the dark. She had heard it read poetry to her on a sun-dappled porch a lifetime ago. She had heard it, thick with false pity, as it delivered the final, fatal blow. Slowly, as if moving underwater, she turned. James Stratton stood by the door, his arm possessively around the waist of a pretty, dark-haired girl no older than 20. He was handsome in a way that was foreign to Dry Hollow, his face unlined by sun and hardship, his clothes tailored and clean, his hands soft. The girl beside him, radiant and blissfully unaware, was a picture of delicate femininity, her dress a cascade of pale blue ruffles. She was everything June was not. James's eyes swept the store, a look of mild amusement on his face at the rustic simplicity of it all. Then his gaze fell on June. For a heartbeat, his confident smile faltered. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with a flicker of annoyance, as if she were a piece of his past he had carelessly failed to discard. The color drained from his face, then returned in a faint, mottled flush. But James Stratton was a man skilled in the art of composure. The mask of the charming gentleman slipped back into place almost instantly. The girl at his side felt him tense. "James, darling, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice like wind chimes. "Of course not, my dear," he said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He looked at June, taking in her plain work dress, the calluses on her hands, the stray wisp of hair that had escaped its severe knot. He was looking at a ghost, and he did not like it. He took a step forward, leaving his fiancée by the door. "June," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Well, I never would have expected to find you here." June said nothing. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She could feel Silas Blackwood's avid curiosity from behind the counter, a tangible, pressing force. She could feel the innocent, questioning gaze of the young woman at the door. All she could do was stand her ground, her spine as rigid as a fence post, and meet his gaze. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. It was a silence he felt compelled to fill. He gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "Are you still here?" he asked. The question was not a question. It was a judgment. It was a dismissal of her entire existence since the moment he had walked out of it. Asterisk. Are you still mired in the past while I have moved on to this bright, beautiful future? Are you still that broken thing I left behind? Asterisk. The walls she had so carefully built threatened to crumble, not into tears, but into a rage so pure and hot it could have set the whole store ablaze. She thought of the nights she had spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had done wrong. She thought of the doctor's sterile office, the quiet, somber words that had pronounced a sentence on her body and on her future. Asterisk. A barren womb. Mrs. Ellison. Asterisk. She wasn't even a Mrs. Then, but the doctor had assumed, everyone had assumed, James had promised. He had held her that night, after the doctor's verdict, and told her it didn't matter. He had sworn he loved asterisk her asterisk, not the idea of a family. 2 weeks later, he was gone. A note was left on the kitchen table, its words about insurmountable differences and wishing her the best, as empty and cold as the house suddenly felt. He hadn't disappeared. He had simply erased her. And now he stood before her, with his new life draped on his arm, and asked if she was asterisk still here asterisk. The bell on the door jingled a third time. Colt Avery stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. He moved with a quiet purpose, his large frame seeming to shrink the already cramped space. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the well-dressed stranger, the nervous girl, Silas frozen behind the counter, and June. He looked at June, and his eyes, steady and unreadable, lingered on her face for a moment. He saw the rigid set of her jaw, the glacial coldness in her eyes that masked a world of pain. He walked to the counter, stopping beside her. He was so close she could feel the faint warmth of his body, smell the clean, sharp scent of pine that clung to him. His presence was a solid, grounding thing in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. James Stratton turned his attention to the newcomer, his expression shifting to one of faint disdain for this rough-looking backwoodsman. "Can we help you?" he asked, his tone implying that Colt was an interruption. Colt didn't look at him. He looked at Silas. "Forgot to ask for a length of chain," he said, his voice calm and low. Then, as if only just noticing James, He turned his head. His gaze was flat, an assessment without emotion. He looked at James's polished shoes, his fine coat, his soft hands. Then his eyes met James's. He gave a single, curt nod, the same one he always gave June. It was a bare acknowledgement of presence. Nothing more. He offered no hand, made no move for an introduction. His work gloves, caked with dirt and sticky with sap, hung at his sides. The gesture, or lack thereof, was a clear and profound statement. It drew a line in the dust of the mercantile floor. On one side stood James, with his cologne and his condescension. On the other stood Colt, grounded and silent, beside June. James felt it. The unspoken judgment from this silent, imposing man was more unnerving than any shouted insult. His smooth facade began to crack. He was used to being the most important man in any room, and here he was being dismissed by a common laborer. "Well," he said, turning abruptly back to June, his voice tight with irritation. "It was surprising to see you. We should be going." He spun on his heel, took his fiancée's arm with a grip that was slightly too firm, and steered her out of the store. The bell gave a final, frantic jingle, and they were gone. The silence they left behind was vast and heavy. June stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. She had not flinched, she had not cried, she had not spoken, but the effort had cost her everything. Colt didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask, "Are you all right?" or "Who was that?" He simply stood beside her, a silent, unmovable presence. He turned to Silas, who was now looking at June with a new, undisguised pity in his eyes. "The chain." "Silas," Colt said, his voice quiet but firm, pulling the storekeeper's attention away from her. As Silas fumbled to measure out the length of heavy chain, June slowly, carefully, unclenched her fists. She placed her coins on the counter. "I'll take the leather," she said, her voice a raw whisper. She gathered the heavy roll in her arms, her muscles straining. She would not let Colt carry it for her. Not now. She needed the weight. She needed the strain. She needed the simple, physical reality of the burden to remind her that she was still standing. She turned and walked out of the store, her back straight, and didn't look back. She didn't see Colt watch her go, his brown eyes holding a deep, quiet understanding that went far beyond words. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 4. I don't need anyone to stay. The 2-mile walk back to the cabin was the longest journey of June's life. The roll of leather in her arms was a dead weight, a penance. With every step, the scene in the mercantile replayed in her mind, each detail a fresh twist of the knife. James's polished smile, the girl's innocent laughter, the casual soul-crushing cruelty of his question asterisk. "Are you still here asterisk?" She was still here, still breathing the dusty air, still carrying the same weary heart in her chest. He had walked away into a new life, a life of bright parlors and soft hands, leaving her to become a ghost in her own story. The rage she had suppressed in the store now burned in her veins, a clean, hot fire that consumed the shame and left only ash. She was furious with him for his weakness, but she was more furious with herself for the part of her that still, after all this time, felt the sting of his abandonment. She didn't look back, but she heard it, the slow, rhythmic creak of Colt Avery's wagon. He was following her, not closely, but keeping a respectful distance, his presence a silent shadow on the road behind her. A part of her wanted to scream at him to leave her be, to let her carry her burden in solitude. Another part was grimly aware that without his silent escort, she might just sit down in the middle of the road and never get up again. The weight of the leather grew with every step. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned. It was a good pain. It was real. It was something she could understand. A physical ache to distract from the hollow one in her soul. She focused on the rhythm of her boots in the dirt, on the strain in her muscles, on the scent of the pines that signaled she was getting closer to the one place she felt a semblance of safety. When her cabin finally came into view, nestled in its clearing, it looked different. The new fence stood sharp and clear, a line drawn against the wilderness. The stable roof was whole. It was a place she was making, a place she was healing with her own 2 hands. It was hers. She reached the porch, her breath coming in ragged bursts, and practically dropped the heavy roll of leather by the door. She stood there, leaning against the door frame, her chest heaving, her eyes closed. The creak of the wagon grew louder and then stopped at the edge of her property, by the gate she had yet to build. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the ground. She didn't open her eyes. She did not want to see him. She did not want to see the pity she was sure would be in his face. Pity was a poison. It weakened you, made you a victim. She would not be a victim. "Miss Ellison," he said. His voice was quiet, just a low rumble in the stillness of the afternoon. She opened her eyes and straightened up, pulling the tattered remnants of her composure around her like a shawl. He stood 20 yards away, by the head of his lead mule, his hands resting on the animal's neck. He wasn't looking at her with pity. His expression was the same as it always was. Steady, calm, observant. But there was a depth to his gaze she hadn't seen before, a quiet intensity that seemed to see right through the walls she was desperately trying to rebuild. "You followed me," she stated. It was an accusation. "The road goes this way," he replied evenly, though they both knew it was an evasion. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, her hand trembling slightly. She had to make it stop. The unspoken kindness, the silent support. It was a language she didn't understand and therefore couldn't trust. Trust was a fool's game, and she had already lost once. "I don't need your help. Mr. Avery, I don't need you leaving things on my porch. And I don't need you following me home." Her words were sharp, each one a stone she was throwing to drive him away. He didn't flinch. He just watched her, his silence more powerful than any argument. He let her words hang in the air until their angry echo faded, leaving only their desperate, painful truth behind. "Whatever you think you saw in town," she pressed on, her voice growing thick. "It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with anyone here. It's my business." "I never figured it was," he said, his voice still quiet. The simplicity of his response disarmed her. She had been ready for a fight, for a defense, for an argument. Not this calm acceptance. The fire of her anger sputtered, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. The truth, the real, ugly fear that was hiding beneath the rage, finally broke free. "I don't need anyone to stay," she said, the words barely a whisper, but they carried all the weight of her past. It was a warning. It was a plea. "Don't you dare make a place for yourself here, because I don't have the strength to watch you leave." It was what she should have said to James all those years ago. Colt let go of the mule and took a few slow steps toward the fence line, stopping just on the other side. He leaned a hand on one of the new posts she had set herself. He looked from the post, to the stable, to the cabin, and then his eyes finally settled back on her. "I'm not leaving," he said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a vow whispered in the heat of passion. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as the stone chimney behind her. He said it the way a man might say, "The sun will rise," or "Winter is coming." It was an observation of a fundamental truth. He was not a man who ran. He was not a man who left things unfinished. He was here. June stared at him, her throat tight, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know what to do with his words. They didn't fit into any of the boxes where she kept her pain and mistrust. They were something else entirely. She had no defense against this kind of quiet, unyielding certainty. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She turned her back on him. Without another word, she pushed her door open, picked up the heavy roll of leather, and dragged it inside. She closed the door firmly behind her, the sound echoing in the silent cabin. For a moment, she leaned against it, listening. She heard the soft clink of chain and knew he was unloading what he'd bought at the store. A few minutes later, she heard the creak of the wagon as it pulled away, the sound fading back into the vast stillness of the woods. He was gone, but his words remained, hanging in the air of her small, lonely home. "I'm not leaving." That night, she went about her ritual. She banked the fire. She washed her face in the basin. She walked to the door. Her hand hesitated over the thick wooden bar. She thought of his words. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she slid the bar into place. Asterisk, thump, asterisk. The sound was familiar, but tonight it felt less like security and more like a surrender to old fears. It wasn't enough. The encounter with James had shaken something loose inside her, a deeper, older terror. She looked around the cabin and her eyes fell on the stiff, bristled broom leaning in the corner. She picked it up. The handle was worn smooth from use. She walked back to the door and wedged the end of the handle firmly under the iron latch, angling the base against a crack in the floorboards. It was a flimsy defense, a trick she had learned in a series of bleak boarding houses in towns she never stayed in long enough to call home. It was the kind of lock a person used when they had nothing left to trust but their own vigilance. She retreated to her cot and lay down, pulling a thin blanket up to her chin. The wind had picked up, and it soughed and moaned around the corners of the cabin, rattling the single pane of glass in the kitchen window she had started leaving open. Usually, that sound would set her on edge, her ears straining for any noise that was out of place. It was the sound of loneliness, the sound of the world trying to break in. But tonight, it was just the wind. She lay there, listening, waiting for the familiar ghosts to come, for the nightmares that always followed the dredging up of the past. She waited for the dream of the empty house, the cold note on the table, the endless falling sensation. But it never came. Beneath the sound of the wind, another sound played in her mind, a quiet, steady counterpoint, a low voice saying, "I'm not leaving asterisk." It wasn't a comfort that erased the pain, but it was an anchor, a single, solid point in a world that had always been shifting sand. The barred door and the propped broom were for the ghosts of the past, for the man who had promised forever and given her nothing. But the words of the man who promised nothing, who simply stated what was, had somehow slipped through the cracks, and for the first time in a very long time, June Ellison slept a deep and dreamless sleep. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 5. A kindness the rumors couldn't kill, asterisk, asterisk. The talk in Dry Hollow settled on June Ellison like a slow, creeping frost. Winter was coming, breathing down from the high peaks and turning the morning ground hard as iron. The town's judgment, it seemed, was hardening right along with it. The story of the well-dressed stranger had been embellished with every telling in Silas Blackwood's store, until June was no longer just a private woman, but a fallen one, a mystery with a shameful past. Her refusal to attend Sunday service was the final piece of evidence. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, spoke of her with a tight-lipped certainty, her words carrying the weight of divine authority. "A spirit that shuns fellowship is a spirit in darkness," she would say, and the other women would nod in agreement, their knitting needles clicking like tiny, judgmental tongues. They began to call her the January woman, for she was, in their eyes, as cold, remote, and barren as the snow that would soon blanket the earth. They saw her strength as hardness, her silence as arrogance, her solitude as a sign that she was not right. They did not see the woman who woke in the pre-dawn dark to split her own firewood. They did not see the meticulous care she took in her work. They only saw the woman who did not bend, who did not ask, and who did not smile. June was not deaf to the whispers. She felt the chill of them whenever she walked down the town's single street. She saw the way conversation stopped when she entered the mercantile, the way women pulled their children a little closer as she passed. The stares no longer felt like flies. They felt like ice. It was a familiar feeling, this cold wall of conjecture, and she met it with a stony indifference that only served to confirm their opinions. She let them have their stories. Stories were just words, and words had never kept a roof from leaking or a fire from dying. Her work became her world. The small cabin was filled with the rich, earthy scent of curing leather. She had cleared a space by the main window, and her workbench was a study in order and precision. Tools lay in their designated places, awls and edgers, groovers and knives, all kept sharp enough to split a hair. Her hands, which the town saw as calloused and unfeminine, moved with a surgeon's grace and a carpenter's certainty. She made things that were meant to last. Saddlebags with seams so tight they could hold water, holsters that hugged a pistol's form like a second skin, reins that felt supple and strong in a rider's hands. Word of her skill began to move quietly among the men of Dry Hollow and the surrounding ranches. They might share their wives' suspicions about her character, but they could not deny the quality of her craft. A man whose livelihood depended on a good saddle and sturdy tack cared more for a straight stitch than for town gossip. They would come to her cabin, their hats in their hands, and speak to her in quiet, respectful tones about leather and rivets. She would listen, nod, and name her price. Her work was honest, and it earned her an independence that the whispers could not touch. Colt Avery continued to be a quiet presence at the periphery of her life. The pretense that he was just passing by had faded. He would come by once a week or so, sometimes with a brace of rabbits, sometimes with a load of firewood he'd cut and split himself. She had learned, by now, that to offer payment was an insult to him. Instead, she began to repay him in her own currency. She mended a tear in his canvas coat with a patch so neat it was nearly invisible. She crafted him a new, sturdier sheath for his hunting knife. They were transactions made in skill and effort, a barter of silent understanding that suited them both. He would find the repaired item waiting for him on a porch post, and he would leave the firewood stacked neatly by her door. No words were needed. One afternoon, as the sky was turning a pale, bruised purple with the threat of the first snow, June was working on a bridle when she heard a hesitant sound outside her door. It wasn't the confident knock of a customer or the familiar tread of Colt's boots. It was a faint, scraping shuffle. She put down her awl, her body tensing. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones were a cause for alarm. She moved to the window and peered through the curtain. Standing on her porch was a small boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He was staring at her door as if trying to summon the courage to knock again. It was Samuel Gable, the preacher's son. June's first instinct was suspicion. What would the son of the woman who judged her most harshly want with her? She opened the door just a crack, the cold air rushing in. The boy jumped, startled. "What do you want?" June's voice was not unkind, but it was direct, stripped of any comforting softness. The boy clutched a bundle of faded wool in his hands. He was trembling, whether from cold or fear. She couldn't tell. "Ma'am," he stammered, his eyes wide and fixed on his worn-out boots. They say you're good with a needle." "I work with leather," she corrected him. "Yes, ma'am, but sewing is sewing, ain't it?" he asked, a simple logic in his childish voice. He finally looked up at her, and his face was filled with a desperate earnestness. "It's my mother's," he said, holding out the bundle. "Her old coat, the one from before we came here." June took the garment from his small, chapped hands. It was a woman's winter coat, made of a fine, dark blue wool that was now threadbare at the elbows and cuffs. The lining was torn near the collar, and a long, jagged rip ran down one of the seams. It was an old coat, well-worn and well-loved, a stark contrast to the stiff, black dresses his mother now wore like armor. This was a coat from another life, a softer life. "The seams torn wide," the boy explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She thinks I don't see or look at it sometimes. She put it in the rag pile for quilting, but she ain't cut it up. She won't ask Mr. Blackwood's wife to fix it. Says she's too busy, but I think she's too proud." June ran her fingers over the torn seam. The boy's simple, loving insight was a stone dropped into the still, cold pond of her heart. He saw not the rigid matriarch of the church, but the woman who secretly mourned a frayed piece of her past. At that moment, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood stopped. Colt had been at the edge of the clearing, working his way through a fallen log for her wood pile. He had been there the whole time, a silent witness. He now leaned on his axe, watching the scene on the porch with his usual quiet intensity. June looked from the boy's anxious face to the worn-out coat. She thought of Mrs. Gable's hard, judgmental eyes. She thought of all the whispers, all the cold shoulders. It would be easy to say no, to send the boy away and let the town keep its opinion of her. Instead, she folded the coat carefully over her arm. "I'll need a few days," she said. The boy's face lit up with a relief so profound it was heartbreaking. "Thank you. Ma'am, I can pay. I've been saving." He started fumbling in his pocket. "No," June said, her voice firm, cutting him off. "There's no charge." "But a boy who looks after his mother like that has already paid," she said. It was the gentlest thing she had said to anyone since arriving in Dry Hollow. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod and closed the door before he could protest further. She walked over to her workbench and laid the small, torn coat down in the place of honor, pushing the expensive leatherwork aside. She stood looking at it for a long time. This small act of mending felt more important than any paid job she had ever taken. It was an act of quiet defiance, a stitch of kindness in a town that had tried to unravel her. Later, as the light began to fail, Colt came to the door. He didn't knock, just stood on the porch until she sensed his presence and opened it. He held out a length of braided leather. "For a door pull," he said. "The latch is cold on the hand in the winter." She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. She looked up at him. His face was unreadable in the twilight, but his eyes held a deep, steady warmth that defied the cold air. He had seen it all. He had heard the boy's plea and had seen her answer. He looked past her, at the small blue coat lying on her workbench. "That town you came from," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They lost someone good." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked away into the gathering dusk, leaving June standing in the doorway, the new leather pull clutched in her hand. His words were not a compliment. They were a verdict. He had weighed the evidence, the whispers of the town, the judgment of the preacher's wife, the ghost of James Stratton, and he had found it all wanting. He saw her not as the town saw her, and not even as she saw herself. He simply saw a good person, and said so. The wind was cold, but for the first time, June didn't feel it. She closed the door, and the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 6. If you leave, don't you dare come back. The first real snow of winter came overnight, a thick, silent blanket that muffled the world and made everything new. For 2 days, Dry Hollow was cut off, a town adrift in a sea of white. June spent the time indoors, the warmth of her stove a welcome comfort. She finished mending the preacher's wife's coat, her small, neat stitches, a testament to a care she rarely showed the world. The act of repairing the worn fabric had been a quiet meditation, a mending of something more than just cloth. On the 3rd day, the sun returned, brilliant and blinding against the snow. The silence was broken by the sounds of men digging out, their shovels scraping against the frozen ground. The air was so cold and still that sound carried for miles. It was this stillness that allowed her to hear the first frantic ringing of the town's fire bell. June went to her door and looked out. A pillar of greasy, black smoke was rising into the pristine blue sky from the center of town, an ugly scar on the perfect day. Her first instinct, born of years of self-preservation, was to close the door. to keep the town's troubles at a distance. It was not her fire. It was not her problem. But she didn't close the door. She thought of the small, mended coat on her workbench. She thought of Colt's words asterisk. They lost someone good asterisk. She stood there, hesitating on the threshold between her isolated world and the community she had so carefully held at arm's length. Then, with a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, she pulled on her heavy coat and boots and began the long walk to town. The scene was one of organized chaos. The blacksmith's shop was ablaze, the flames feeding on the coal dust and dry timber, roaring with a terrifying hunger. The heat was so intense it melted the snow in a wide, slushy circle around the building. Men had formed a bucket brigade from the town's main well, but their efforts were feeble against the inferno. The water they threw hissed into steam a foot from the flames. Sparks shot into the air, threatening the roofs of the adjacent buildings. "Jebediah's still in there," someone shouted. "The old fool went back for his father's anvil." A wave of helpless horror passed through the crowd. Jebediah was the blacksmith, a man as old and stubborn as the mountains, his wife having passed years ago. The shop was his whole life. To go back into that furnace for a piece of iron seemed like madness, a final act of devotion to his craft. The doorway was a roaring mouth of fire, and no one dared to approach it. Then, a figure broke from the line of men. It was Colt. He moved without haste, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He didn't shout, he didn't posture, he simply acted. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket, dunked it in a half-frozen watering trough until it was soaked, and threw it over his head and shoulders. Before anyone could protest, he ran straight into the burning building. The crowd let out a collective gasp. June's heart leaped into her throat, a cold, hard knot of terror. She gripped the worn handle of a shovel someone had dropped, her knuckles turning white. She watched the doorway, a black hole in a wall of fire, and held her breath. The seconds stretched into an eternity, marked only by the crackle of the flames and the groan of tortured timber from within. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, began to pray aloud, her voice a thin, reedy wail against the roar. Just as the crowd began to lose hope, a shape emerged from the smoke. It was Colt, half carrying, half dragging the old blacksmith. Jebediah was soot-blackened and coughing violently, but alive. Colt pushed him into the arms of the waiting men and then stumbled to his knees, shrugging off the smoldering blanket. A cheer went up, but June saw what the others, in their relief, did not. As Colt pushed himself to his feet, he favored his left side. A dark stain was spreading across the shoulder of his flannel shirt, a stain too dark to be water. A piece of the roof, a burning rafter, had caught him on its way down. He tried to wave off the concern, his focus on getting Jebediah settled, but June was already moving. She pushed her way through the gawking townsfolk, her purpose clear and direct. She ignored the surprised looks, the whispers that followed her. She walked straight up to Colt, her eyes fixed on the blood now beginning to drip from his sleeve onto the clean, white snow. "That needs tending," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at her, his face smudged with soot, his eyes weary but clear. He seemed about to protest, to say it was nothing, but he saw the look on her face and simply nodded. The fire was the town's problem now. This was hers. She turned and started walking, and he followed, a step behind her. They walked away from the fire, away from the shouts and the chaos, back down the path toward the quiet of the woods. The town watched them go. This strange pairing, the silent, heroic man and the cold, reclusive woman who had suddenly, inexplicably, claimed him. The walk back to the cabin was a silent one. The only sound was the crunch of their boots in the snow. When they reached her porch, she opened the door and stood aside, holding it for him. It was the first time he had ever been invited inside. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then ducked his head and entered her home. The cabin was small but clean, and surprisingly warm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Her leather working tools were laid out neatly on her workbench. The mended blue coat was folded on a chair, waiting to be returned. The space felt intensely personal, a reflection of the woman herself, ordered, private, and self-contained. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the simple wooden chair at her small kitchen table. He did as he was told, slumping into the chair with a weariness that showed the true cost of his bravery. June moved with a clinical efficiency. She stoked the fire in the kitchen stove, put a kettle on to boil, and retrieved a small wooden box. It contained not thread and thimbles, but clean linen bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, and a curved suturing needle. She was prepared for injury in a way that spoke of a life that had known its share of it. "You'll have to take off the shirt," she said, her back to him as she poured a measure of whiskey into a glass. She heard him grunt with pain as he tried to pull the blood-soaked fabric over his head. After a moment of struggle, he fell still. "It stuck," he said, his voice tight. She turned, a pair of shears in her hand. "Then I'll cut it." She approached him, her movements steady. The air between them was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the wound. This was an intimacy neither of them had anticipated. She carefully cut through the sleeve and then down the side of the flannel shirt, peeling the wet, sticky cloth away from his skin. The wound was ugly, a deep, jagged gash on the cap of his shoulder, blackened at the edges from the burning wood, and bleeding sluggishly. It would need stitches, but what made her breath catch was the landscape of his skin. His back and shoulders were a road map of old scars, pale white lines that crisscrossed the sun-darkened skin. This was not the first time he had been torn open. Her hands, which had been so steady at her workbench, began to tremble. It was a faint tremor, almost imperceptible, but she felt it, a betrayal by her own body. She poured the whiskey onto a clean rag, the sharp scent filling the small kitchen. "This will sting," she said, her voice low. "I reckon it will," he breathed. As she pressed the rag to the wound to clean it, he hissed, his whole body going rigid, but he made no other sound. She worked quickly, her focus narrowed to the task, cleaning the wound, assessing the damage, preparing the needle. But she couldn't stop the shaking in her hands. It wasn't the blood. She had seen worse. It was him. It was his quiet strength, his scarred back, his presence at her kitchen table, the smell of smoke and blood and winter air that clung to him. It was the terrifying thought of what she would have felt if he hadn't walked out of that fire. He was watching her, his brown eyes intense. He had been silent, but he had missed nothing. "Are you trembling because of the blood?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Or because of me?" His question cut through her concentration, straight to the heart of the fear she was trying to suppress. She paused, the threaded needle held aloft in her shaking hand. She couldn't lie to him. She couldn't lie to herself. She looked at the wound, at the vulnerable flesh beneath the scars. And the truth came out, raw and painful. "Because I know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everyone leaves. One way or another. In a cloud of smoke or with a cold note on a table, they leave." Colt didn't answer right away. He just sat there, under her hands, absorbing the weight of her confession. The fire in the stove popped and hissed, the only sound in the cabin. The silence was not empty. It was a space where he was considering her words, truly hearing the lifetime of pain behind them. She took a shaky breath and began the first stitch, her hands suddenly steadier now that the truth was out. She worked in silence, closing the wound with the neat, even sutures, her leather-working skills translating to the mending of human flesh. When she was finally done, when the bandage was tied neatly in place, he spoke again. His voice was quiet, but it held the unshakable certainty of the mountains outside her window. He looked her straight in the eye. "Then I'll just have to prove you wrong." ***. Part 7. Prove You'll Stay. The days that followed were a quiet, fragile truce. June finished the preacher's wife's coat, the stitches along the torn seam a small, perfect scar. She returned it to the boy, Samuel, meeting him on the path to town to spare him the long walk. He gave her a shy, grateful smile and a single, polished river stone, a treasure from his pocket. She accepted it with a solemn nod and put it on her windowsill where it caught the pale winter light. Colt did not return immediately. The wound on his shoulder needed time to heal, and he was not a man to show weakness, but his presence lingered. The woodpile he had built for her was a fortress against the cold. The new leather pull on her door was a constant, tangible reminder of his quiet care. His words echoed in the silence of her cabin, a challenge and a promise asterisk. "Then I'll just have to prove you wrong." She tried to dismiss them. They were just words, spoken in a moment of pain and intimacy. Words were wind. She had built her life on the more reliable foundation of actions. But his words had been different. They hadn't been a flowery promise of forever. They had been a simple, rugged statement of intent. They had the weight of the timbers he hauled, the solidity of the earth he walked on. A week passed. A storm blew in from the north, a furious squall of wind and driving snow that buried the world anew. It howled through the pines, a lonely, predatory sound, and rattled the frame of her small cabin. For 2 days, she was a prisoner of the weather, the world shrinking to the space between her 4 walls. On the second night of the storm, as the wind screamed its loudest and the snow beat against her window like handfuls of thrown gravel, there came a knock at her door. It was not a timid knock. It was solid, firm, and deliberate. 3 distinct raps that cut through the gale's fury. June froze, a half-eaten biscuit halfway to her mouth. No one would be out in this. No sane person would be traveling the path to her cabin in a blizzard. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. Her first thought was of the heavy bar leaning against the wall. She rose from her chair and crept to the door, her stockinged feet silent on the cold floorboards. She peered through the tiny gap in the curtain. A figure stood on her porch, broad-shouldered and dark against the swirling white. Snow caked his hat and shoulders. It was Colt. Of course, it was Colt. Her immediate reaction was a flare of anger, hot and irrational. What was he doing here? What did he want? Coming through a storm, testing her, pushing at the boundaries she had so carefully drawn. She should leave the door barred. She should let him stand out there until he gave up and went away. That was the safe thing to do. Safety was all she had ever known. She stood there, her hand hovering over the wooden bar, and a war raged within her. The voice of her past was a cold, sensible whisper. Asterisk, he will leave. They all leave. He will stay until it is inconvenient, until he is bored, until he finds someone softer, someone whole. And when he leaves, this will hurt more than any of the times before, because you let him get closer. Keep the bar in place. You know how to survive this. You do not know how to survive hope. But another voice, one she had not heard in a very long time, rose to challenge it. It was a quieter voice, but it was persistent. Asterisk, this one is not like the others. Did James Stratton ever stand in a storm for you? Did he ever bring you firewood without being asked? Did he ever look at your scars and see a good person? Did he ever run into a burning building for a stubborn old man? Asterisk. His actions. She had always trusted actions, and his actions had built a case against her fear, one quiet deed at a time. The rope, the cedar shakes, the potatoes, the way he stood beside her in the store, a silent shield, the way he looked at her now, not with pity, but with a simple, unwavering recognition. He knocked again, 3 more solid raps. He was patient. He would wait. June took a deep, shaky breath. The warmth of the cabin felt like a cage, her solitude a prison she had built for herself. The storm outside was no more violent than the one inside her heart. She was so tired of being strong, so tired of being alone, so tired of listening to the ghosts that whispered warnings in her ear. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the door. the cold seeping into her skin. She had to know. She had to put his words to the test, and her own heart along with them. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a strained, muffled thing, nearly lost in the shriek of the wind. "What do you want?" His reply came back, calm and clear, as if there were no storm at all. "Came to see if the roof was holding." It was a simple excuse, a practical reason, but they both knew it was more than that. He had come through the blizzard to stand on her porch, to knock on her door, to see if she would open it. He was answering the challenge she had never officially issued. Her hand finally closed over the wooden bar. It felt immensely heavy, weighted with all the years of her solitude. Her throat was tight. The words were a dare, a final, desperate test thrown against the door that separated them. "Prove it," she whispered to the wood. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by a terrifying surge of hope. "Prove you'll stay." There was a pause on the other side. The wind howled, filling the silence. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would not answer. She thought he would turn and walk away, proving her fears right once and for all. Then his voice came again, low and steady, a bedrock beneath the storm. "Watch me." It was not a plea. It was not a promise. It was an invitation, an instruction. Asterisk. My words are done. Now, you will see my actions. And that was it. The war was over. One side had not won. It had simply been exhausted into surrender. June closed her eyes. Her hand, slick with sweat, gripped the bar. She was not opening the door because she believed him. Belief was a luxury she couldn't afford, a fragile thing that had been shattered too many times. To believe would be to lie to herself, to ignore every scar on her soul that told her trust was a fool's errand. No, this was something different. This was an act of pure, terrifying will. She was opening the door because, for the first time in a decade, she wanted to believe. The desire, long buried and starved, was now a ravenous thing. She wanted to believe that not all men were like James. She wanted to believe that kindness could exist without a price. She wanted to believe that a person could be a harbor, not just another storm. She was choosing to want, and that single choice was the bravest thing she had ever done. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the heavy bar from its iron brackets. The sound of it, a scraping groan of wood on metal, was the sound of her fortress being decommissioned. She set the bar quietly on the floor. Her hand moved to the iron latch, cold and final. She lifted it. The wind tore the door from her grasp, throwing it inward with a violent crash against the wall. The storm rushed in, a blast of snow and ice and raw, wild air. And in the center of it all, framed by the swirling white and the howling dark, stood Colt. His hat was low, his shoulders broad under a layer of fresh snow. He made no move to come inside. He simply stood there on the threshold, waiting, his face calm and his eyes fixed on hers, letting her be the one to close the distance. The door was open. Asterisk. Part 8. A Night Without Words. Asterisk. The door, thrown open by the storm, slammed against the interior wall, shaking the small cabin to its foundation. For a moment, the world was a vortex of chaos. Snow and wind tore through the room, extinguishing a candle on the table and sending papers from her workbench fluttering to the floor. June was frozen, a statue in the heart of the maelstrom, her hand still on the latch. Colt did not wait. He took 2 long strides, stepping over the threshold and into her life. He put his broad shoulder to the heavy wooden door and, with a grunt of effort, forced it shut against the gale's immense pressure. The roar of the storm was instantly cut off, replaced by a sudden, ringing silence. The only sounds left were the crackle of the fire, the frantic beating of June's own heart, and the ragged sound of their shared breath in the cold air. The wooden bar, the symbol of her long isolation, lay inert and forgotten on the floor between them. He stood with his back to the door, His hand still pressed against the wood as if to ensure it would hold. Snow melted from his hat and coat, puddling at his feet. He was a force of nature in his own right, a piece of the storm that had come inside. Yet his presence felt like the calm at its very eye. He slowly, deliberately, turned to face her. His eyes found hers in the flickering firelight. He saw the terror there, the wild, cornered look of an animal that has just gambled its life on a single, desperate hope. And in that moment, he seemed to understand everything. He understood that this was not a victory, but a fragile truce. He knew that any sudden move, any wrong word, could shatter the delicate trust she had just extended. He did not touch her. He did not step closer. Instead, he moved with a slow, careful reverence. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh to dislodge the snow, and hung it on a peg by the door. Then he shrugged out of his heavy winter coat, the movement pulling at the newly healed wound on his shoulder. June saw him wince, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, but he said nothing. He hung the coat beside the hat. He was making himself smaller, less threatening, a guest in her home. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the neatness, the order, the lonely solitude of it all. His eyes lingered on the single cup and plate on her table. Then he turned his attention to the hearth. The fire, battered by the initial blast of wind from the door, had dwindled to a sullen orange glow. He walked to the fireplace, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He picked up the iron poker and gently stirred the embers, coaxing them back to life. He reached for the firewood stacked in the crate beside the hearthwood he had cut and carried here himself, and selected a thick, dry log of pine. He laid it carefully on the embers, and with a soft whoosh, new flames licked up, bright and eager, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. June watched his every move, her body rigid with a tension that was equal parts fear and fascination. He was bringing life back to her fire, to the very heart of her home. He was a man who knew what to do in a storm. He knew how to build, how to mend, how to make things warm and safe. As he worked, a particularly violent gust of wind hit the cabin. The entire structure groaned, and a fine sifting of dust and snow fell from the rafters. Without thinking, Colt reached up and placed his large, calloused hand flat against the main ceiling beam, right above his head. It was an instinctive gesture, a man testing the strength of a support, steadying the bones of the house against the assault of the wind. The gesture was simple, practical, and yet it felt profound. He was not just a guest in her home, he was a guardian of it. He was holding up the roof. The sight of his hand on the beam, strong and sure, finally broke the spell of June's paralysis. She needed to do something, to anchor herself with a familiar task. Her hands were trembling, a tremor that started deep in her chest. She turned to the stove, her movements jerky and uncertain. Tea? She would make tea. The ritual was a comfort. She took down the small tin of dried mint leaves, her fingers fumbling with the lid. The sharp, clean scent filled her nostrils, a smell of summer and calm. She filled the kettle from the water bucket, her hands shaking so much that water sloshed onto the floor. She ignored it. She placed the kettle on the stove, her ears attuned to the rising hiss of the water as it began to heat. She took down 2 tin cups from a shelf. 2. The sight of them sitting side by side on the table felt revolutionary. She spooned the fragrant mint leaves into each cup, her shaking hands making a mess of it. She did not care. This was not about making tea. This was about surviving the most terrifying peace she had ever known. Colt remained by the fire, giving her space. He had not spoken a single word since entering. He seemed to understand that the silence was a language they both knew, a territory where they could meet without the risk of clumsy words. He sat on the floor, on the rough-hewn stone of the hearth, leaning his good shoulder against the chimney, and simply watched the flames. He was content to wait. He had told her to watch him, and now he was giving her the chance to do just that, in her own time, on her own terms. When the kettle whistled, its shrill cry sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She poured the boiling water into the cups. The steam that rose was fragrant and soothing. She picked up the cups, her hands still not entirely steady, and walked toward the fire. She handed one to him. He looked up, his face illuminated by the firelight, and took it from her. His large, rough fingers brushed against hers for a barest second, sending a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot cup. It was the first time they had touched since she had stitched his shoulder. She did not sit beside him on the hearth. That felt too close, too intimate, a step she was not yet ready to take. Instead, she retreated to her own rocking chair, a familiar island of safety a few feet away. She pulled a woolen blanket over her lap and cradled the hot cup in her hands, letting its warmth seep into her cold fingers. And so they sat. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and ice. But inside the cabin, there was a deep and profound stillness. They drank their mint tea, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the gale. He did not press her with questions. He did not fill the quiet with talk. He simply shared the space with her, his presence a steady, unwavering anchor. June watched him over the rim of her cup. She watched the way the firelight played over the rugged planes of his face, catching the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She saw the quiet strength in the set of his jaw, the gentle way he held his cup in his large hands. This man had run into a burning building. He had walked through a blizzard, and now he sat by her fire as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A slow, unfamiliar warmth began to spread through her chest, a gentle thawing of a winter that had lasted for years. She looked around the small room at the dancing shadows on the log walls, at the warm glow of the fire, at the man who sat so quietly by her hearth. The wind still beat against the windows, a lonely and violent sound. The cabin still groaned under the pressure of the storm. But for the first time since she had arrived, the house was no longer cold. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 9. The People Who Are Meant to Stay. Asterisk, asterisk. The world was born anew the morning after the storm. A profound silence lay over the snow-covered landscape, the air so clean and cold it felt like the first breath of creation. Inside the small cabin, a different kind of quiet reigned. It was a quiet of shared space, of two people breathing the same warm air, the unspoken questions of the future held at bay by the simple peace of the present. Colt did not leave at dawn. He stayed, and together they moved through the small, domestic rituals of a new day. He went out first, his broad shoulders breaking a path through the thigh-high snow to the woodpile, returning with an armload of firewood. June had the coffee boiling by the time he came back in, the rich, bitter aroma filling the one-room cabin. They ate a breakfast of biscuits and bacon, sitting at her small kitchen table. It was the first meal June had shared with another person in years, and the simple act felt both terrifyingly intimate and deeply, fundamentally right. There were few words, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with small gestures, the way he refilled her coffee cup without asking, the way she passed him the last biscuit, a silent offering. When it was time for him to go, there was no awkward farewell. He simply pulled on his still damp coat, met her eyes across the room, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The roof held. He said, "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet. "It held." He left in the full, bright light of mid-morning. He did not try to be discreet. He walked down the path he had forged, a clear track leading from her door back toward the town. He was a man with nothing to hide. But Dry Hollow was a town that thrived on things done in secret. By afternoon, the story had been told and retold across the counter of the mercantile, its shape changing with each telling. A trapper, checking his lines, had seen Colt Avery leaving the January woman's cabin, leaving after being snowed in with her for 2 full nights. The whispers started as a spark and, fanned by the cold winds of piety and boredom, quickly grew into a firestorm of speculation. Silas Blackwood polished his counter with a vigor reserved for only the most scandalous news. 2 nights, he'd say to a rapt audience of miners and ranchers. A man and a woman, alone, with a blizzard for a chaperone. It's a disgrace. Mrs. Gable declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She had come for thread, but had stayed for the gossip. She spurns the Lord's house, and now she engages in open sin. What example does that set? The man is a hero, perhaps, but he has been led astray by a woman of low character. The narrative was set. He was the town's hero, momentarily fallen. She was the temptress in the woods, the cold-hearted sinner who had finally shown her true colors. June was not ignorant of the coming storm. She felt it in the way the air shifted when she walked to town 2 days later to deliver a finished set of reins. Conversations fell silent. Eyes followed her, no longer with mere curiosity, but with a hard, condemnatory glare. She kept her chin high and her back straight, her face an unreadable mask. She had lived with judgment before. This was nothing new. But she had never before had someone to share it with. That evening, as dusk settled, she told Colt what she had heard, what she had felt in the town's cold appraisal. He had come by to check her stitches, as he called it, though she knew he was really there to see how she was faring. He listened, his face grim, his jaw tight with anger he did not voice. "Let them talk," he said when she was finished. "Their words are just noise." "Sometimes noise is all it takes to burn a person's house down," she replied, her voice weary. The official condemnation came the next day, in the form of Reverend Gable. He arrived on horseback, a grim soldier of the Lord marching to save a wayward soul. June saw him coming up the path and met him on the porch, crossing her arms over her chest. She would not invite this judgment into her home. "Miss Ellison," he began, his tone a practiced blend of sorrow and authority. "I come to you as a shepherd to a lamb that has strayed from the flock." "I was not aware I was part of your flock, Reverend," June said, her voice even. He flushed, his piety pricked by her directness. "We are all part of the Lord's flock, my dear, and it is my duty to voice a grave concern, a concern for your immortal soul." He cleared his throat. "It has been brought to my attention, it is the talk of the town, that you have been living here with Mr. Avery, unmarried." He said the last word as if it were a disease. June looked at him, at his soft hands that had never known a day of hard labor, at his self-satisfied face that knew nothing of her life, nothing of her pain, nothing of the quiet, steady decency of the man he was so quick to condemn. A lifetime of suppressed anger rose in her, not a hot rage, but a cold, clear certainty. She had been judged by a man who left, and now she was being judged by a town that had never once offered her a hand. She slowly uncrossed her arms. She lifted her head, and her gaze was as sharp and unyielding as a shard of winter ice. "Reverend," she said, her voice low and steady, ringing with a truth that silenced the chirping of the birds in the pines. "You are mistaken. I am not living with a man to whom I am not wed." She paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "I am living with a man who did not abandon me when I was in need. When this town saw a sinner, he saw a person. When the storm came, he did not offer empty prayers from a distance. He stood in my home and held up the roof. I would think a shepherd would know the value of a man who does not desert his flock, no matter how small." Reverend Gable was stunned into silence. He had come prepared for tears, for denial, for shame. He had not come prepared for this. She had taken his moral accusation and turned it into a testament of loyalty, a parable of true Christian charity that shamed his own congregation's petty gossip. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say. She had not denied the facts. She had simply redefined them with a truth he could not refute. He finally mumbled something about praying for her, turned his horse, and retreated back down the path, his righteous crusade in tatters. That Sunday, the whole of Dry Hollow was waiting. The church bell tolled, calling the faithful and the curious alike. Every person in town expected June Ellison to stay hidden in her cabin, shamed into exile. They expected Colt Avery, the town's hero, to quietly distance himself from the scandal. But as the last bell began to ring, two figures appeared at the end of the street, walking side by side. It was Colt and June. She wore her best dress, a simple gray calico, clean and pressed. He wore a clean shirt and denim trousers, his bearing dignified and resolute. They walked through a sea of whispers and hostile stares, their eyes fixed on the church at the end of the street. June's hands were clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. She could feel the weight of 100 judgments pressing down on her. And for a moment, her steps faltered. And then she felt it. As they reached the bottom step of the church, where the gables and the deacons stood like a panel of inquisitors, Colt moved a half-step closer. He did not speak. He did not look at the crowd. He simply raised his large, warm hand and placed it gently on the small of her back. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was not a lover's caress. It was a statement. It was a silent, solid anchor in a turbulent sea of condemnation. The warmth of his hand spread through the thin fabric of her dress, a current of strength that flowed directly into her spine. It said, "I am here. You are not alone. Let them look. Their judgment is on us both." The whispers died. The stares faltered. The town of Dry Hollow looked on in stunned silence as Colt Avery, their hero, stood with the January woman, his hand on her back, a quiet and unshakable declaration of allegiance. He did not speak a word. He didn't have to. With his hand still resting gently on her back, he guided her up the steps. They walked past the preacher and his wife, past the shocked faces of the congregation, and stepped together through the open doors and into the heart of the church. They had come not to beg for forgiveness, but to show that they had nothing to be forgiven for. **, Part 10. Where someone does not leave ***. The hard frost of judgment from the town did not break, but it did recede. After that Sunday, a grudging sort of respect settled over Dry Hollow. The whispers didn't vanish entirely, but they lost their venomous edge. June and Colt had walked into the heart of the town's disapproval and had not flinched. In a place that valued grit above all else, their quiet defiance was a language everyone understood. Winter slowly relinquished its grip. The snow melted in patches, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath, and the air began to carry the scent of thaw and the promise of mud. Life in the cabin settled into a new rhythm, a quiet duet. Colt was there more often than not. He never officially moved in. There was no discussion, no grand declaration. He simply began to exist in her space as naturally as the fire in the hearth. He kept his own small cabin on the other side of the valley, but most evenings found him at her table. He would work his own timber claims during the day, and she would work her leather. The sounds of their separate labors a comfortable backdrop to the shared silence. He mended the sagging porch step that had bothered her for months. She, in turn, crafted a new, sturdier bridle for his lead mule. The stitching perfect, the leather supple. They were building a life the same way they had built everything else, not with words, but with their hands. June felt the ice around her own heart beginning to thaw, a slow, and sometimes painful, process. She found herself leaving the front door unbarred until the last light had faded from the sky. She learned the specific sound of his wagon creaking up the path and found that her hands no longer tensed when she heard it. She even caught herself, on a rare occasion, humming a tune as she worked, the sound so unfamiliar in her own throat that it startled her into silence. The January woman was slowly, cautiously, stepping into the spring of her own life. Then came a morning, bright and clear. When the new rhythm was broken, she woke to find him already dressed. He wasn't stoking the fire or putting the coffee on to boil. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, which he had brought inside the night before to protect from the damp. His movements were purposeful, final. He was preparing for a journey. The old, familiar coldness seeped back into June's bones. She lay perfectly still on her cot, watching him through slitted eyes. Her breath caught in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, the moment her ghosts had always warned her was coming. He had stayed through the winter, had seen her through the storm. But now the world was opening up again. The roads were clear. It was time to move on. That was the way of things. He gathered the few things that were his: a whetstone, a spare coat, the knife she had made the sheath for. He was quiet, efficient, erasing his presence from her home. He was leaving, and he was going to do it without even the courtesy of a goodbye. The pain was a sharp, physical blow, a confirmation of her deepest fear. She was a place to take shelter, not a place to build a home. She closed her eyes, unable to watch anymore. She heard his heavy boots on the floorboards, the soft jingle of the harness, the creak of the door opening and closing. Then, silence. He was gone. The cabin, which had felt so warm and full just moments before, was suddenly vast and achingly empty. She lay there for a long time, listening to the crushing silence. She refused to cry. Tears were a luxury she had given up long ago. Instead, a cold, hard anger began to form, a protective shell around the wound. She had been a fool to open the door, a fool to take down the bar, a fool to believe, even for a moment, that this time would be different. Finally, she forced herself to get up. The day had to be faced. Work had to be done. She would survive this. She had survived worse. She would put the bar back on the door. She would forget the sound of his voice and the warmth of his hand on her back. She would go back to being the woman who needed no one. She walked to the kitchen table to get the coffee tin, and that's when she saw it. Lying in the center of the table, a small, dark sprig against the pale wood, was a piece of dried mint. It was from the tin she had used to make them tea on the night of the storm. A single, fragile, fragrant reminder of the night she had let him in. Was this his goodbye? A final, gentle cruelty. A memento of the hope he had awakened only to extinguish. She stared at it, and the cold anger she had been building began to crack. She spent the day in a fever of work, trying to sweat out the pain and the memory. She attacked a thick piece of hide with a vengeance, her knife slicing through the leather with a vicious precision. But the silence of the cabin was a constant accusation. Every creak of the logs was a sound that was not him. The empty peg by the door where his coat had hung was a hole in the fabric of her world. The solitude that had once been her armor now felt like a punishment. The sun arced across the sky, and the afternoon light began to slant through the trees, long and golden. She worked until her hands were raw and her shoulders ached. She was just beginning to accept the new, harsh reality of her loneliness when she heard it. A sound, a familiar sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of a wagon. She dropped her knife. Her heart stopped, then started again with a painful, hopeful lurch. She rushed to the window, her hands pressed against the glass. It was him. His wagon was coming up the path, but it was moving slowly, weighed down by a heavy load. It was piled high with freshly milled lumber, thick coils of new rope, and a wooden box that held the unmistakable shape of a window frame. He pulled the wagon to a stop, not at the edge of the property, but right beside the porch. He swung himself down, his movements weary but sure. He looked up at the cabin, his eyes finding her in the window. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave her a slow, small smile. June's legs felt weak. She stumbled to the door, her hand trembling as she lifted the latch. She opened it and stepped out onto the porch, the cool afternoon air on her face. He walked toward her, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He looked from the loaded wagon back to her face, his expression serious, his eyes asking a question his lips had not yet formed. "The cabin up at my claim," he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. The spring melt took it, undermined the foundation. Nothing left to salvage. June said nothing, her mind reeling. "So I was thinking," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "This place is sturdy. You built it upright, but a house can always use improvements. Another room. Maybe a bigger window to let in the morning light." He paused, taking a breath. "But that's a lot of work for one person." He looked her straight in the eye, and all the loneliness of her day, all the fear of her past, collapsed under the weight of his steady gaze. "Is there room in this house?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear as a church bell. "For one more." The world stood still. The wind in the pines held its breath. This was it, the final question, the one that mattered more than all the others. June looked at his hopeful, earnest face. She looked at the wagon, loaded not with things for a journey, but with things to build a future. Her eyes drifted past him, into the cabin, to the wall beside the door, to a single, empty, iron hook on the wall, a hook she had never used, a hook that had been waiting. She didn't need to speak. Her answer was in her gaze, in the slow, trembling smile that finally broke across her face, a true and genuine smile that lit her up from the inside out. She lifted her hand and pointed to the empty hook on the wall. "That hook," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "It's never held anything." She looked back at him, her eyes shining. "It's time it did." Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. It's wonderful to see how far these tales travel. Please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. If you'd like to give an extra measure of support, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.